To weaken Michael further, Ruth turned her attention to his investors, the people who provided him with the money to keep his business running. She began planting seeds of doubt among them, using anonymous tips and insider information to make them question Michael's financial stability. She sent emails and notes warning investors about his growing debts and unreliable projects. Some of these messages were delivered anonymously, while others came from people she paid to pose as concerned insiders. Slowly, the investors began pulling out their funds, leaving Michael scrambling for capital. The distrust spread like wildfire. Clients canceled deals and lenders stopped approving loans. Michael found himself isolated and unable to secure the resources he needed to save his business. Each of these steps, buying his properties, undermining his competitiveness, and driving away his investors, led to Michael's ultimate downfall. Ruth ensured that every move worked in harmony to dismantle his empire piece by piece. But as Michael's world crumbled, Ruth's power grew. The properties she purchased, the influence she wielded over his rivals, and the fear she spread among his investors all consolidated under her control. From the outside, she appeared to be the supportive wife standing by her husband during hard times. In reality, she was pulling the strings, ensuring that her plan unfolded exactly as she had envisioned. Ruth's plan wasn't just about destroying Michael's business, it was about taking everything he valued and making it hers. She wanted him to feel the weight of loss, the same way she had felt when her mother died. And for a time, it seemed as though her plan had worked perfectly. The last remnants of Michael's empire slipped through his fingers when the final property he owned, a prime piece of land in Maitama, was sold at auction. It was the last hope he had, the only thing keeping him tethered to the dream of rebuilding his once mighty real estate business. Now it was gone, leaving him with nothing but shame and disbelief. That evening, the tiny apartment in Guarimpa felt suffocating. Michael sat on a worn-out couch, his head in his hands, his body shaking with a grief too deep for words. His empire, his reputation, everything he had built over the years, it was all gone. Ruth sat across from him, quietly folding clothes on the small table. She looked calm, too calm. The sight of her serene face sent a wave of anger rushing through Michael. He couldn't hold it in anymore. "How can you sit there like this?" Michael's voice cracked as he shouted. "We've lost everything. Our home, the cars, the business, everything. And you act like none of it matters. Do you even care?" Ruth looked up from the shirt she was folding, her expression unreadable. "It's not the end of the world, Michael," she said softly. Her calm tone only fueled his frustration. "Not the end of the world?" Michael stood up, his tall frame towering over her. "Do you understand what's happening to us? I've lost everything I've worked for, everything I've sacrificed for. And you?" His voice broke, the words choking in his throat. "You sit there, acting like this is just another day." Ruth placed the shirt down slowly, her movements deliberate. She looked up at Michael, her eyes finally showing a glint of something, pain, anger, or maybe regret. "Do you really think you're the only one who has lost something, Michael?" she asked quietly. Her voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it. Michael stared at her, confused. "What are you talking about?" Ruth sighed and leaned back in her chair. For a moment, it seemed like she was gathering her thoughts, deciding how much to say. Then she began to speak. "My mother," she said, her voice steady but cold, "was a maid in your father's house." Michael blinked, the words not fully registering. "What does that have to do with anything?" "She worked herself to death," Ruth continued, ignoring his interruption. "Your parents treated her like she was less than human. She cleaned, cooked, served, and was still insulted and overworked every day. One night she collapsed. She died the next morning, and they buried her like she was nothing." Her words hit Michael like a punch to the gut. He sat back down, stunned. "I didn't know," he began, but Ruth cut him off. "Of course you didn't," she said bitterly. "Why would you? You were just a boy then, living in comfort while my mother suffered. But I knew. I saw it all. And I swore that day that I would make your family pay for what they did to her." Michael's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The woman he had shared his life with, the woman he thought he knew, was a stranger. "I married you for one reason," Ruth said, her voice growing harder. "To destroy the legacy of the family that destroyed mine. I used everything I've built, all the wealth I earned, to take you down. Every property you sold, I bought. Every failed deal I orchestrated. Why do you think your competitors always seemed one step ahead of you?" Michael's head spun. It was too much to process. He felt like the walls were closing in. "But why?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Ruth leaned forward, her face inches from his. "Do you know why we've never had children, Michael?" she asked, her tone cutting through the silence like a blade. Because I made sure we wouldn't. I couldn't risk getting too attached to you. This was never about love. It was about justice, for my mother. The weight of her words crushed him. Every moment they had shared, every kind gesture, every plan for the future, it was all a lie. Or was it? Michael couldn't tell anymore. His world had collapsed, and now even his marriage was revealed to be part of an elaborate plot for revenge. Ruth leaned back, her face softening just slightly. You asked me why I'm so calm, she said quietly. Now you know. I've already lost everything that mattered to me. This, she gestured around the room. This was always part of the plan. The room fell silent, the air heavy with the weight of what had just been revealed. Michael's tears stopped, replaced by a numbness he couldn't describe. Ruth's eyes held no malice now, only a quiet sadness. He couldn't tell if it was regret or the exhaustion of carrying a burden for so long. And for the first time in his life, Michael didn't know what to say. Michael sat on the edge of the old, creaky bed in their cramped apartment, his hands gripping the sides of his head as if trying to keep his thoughts from spilling out. The words Ruth had spoken moments ago hung heavy in the air, suffocating and loud despite the silence between them. His wife, the woman who had stood by him during every high and low of his life, had just confessed to orchestrating the collapse of his entire world. He couldn't make sense of it. Why? He finally muttered, his voice hoarse and trembling. Why would you do this to me? Was it all a lie? Our marriage, our life, was it just part of your plan to destroy me? Ruth stood by the small window, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The light from the street lamp outside illuminated her face, making her expression hard to read. She didn't respond immediately, and her silence cut deeper than any words could have. It was as though she was weighing the worth of an explanation, deciding if he even deserved one. Michael's mind raced, trying to piece together the life he thought he knew. Their wedding day, their struggles, their shared dreams, had any of it been real? He thought of the way she had held him when his mother passed away, the way she had smiled at him over simple meals, the way she had whispered words of encouragement when he doubted himself. How could a woman capable of such love also be capable of such cold betrayal? The anger bubbled up in him, hot and sharp. You watched me struggle, he said, his voice rising. You watched me lose everything, everything I worked for, and you said nothing. You let me believe I was a failure, Ruth. I didn't let you believe anything, Michael, she finally said, her voice calm but tinged with something he couldn't place, sadness, perhaps, or defiance. You believed what you wanted to believe. You never questioned why things were falling apart because your pride wouldn't let you. I didn't force you to make bad decisions. Her words felt like a slap. Michael jumped to his feet, pacing the small room like a caged animal. You think this is about pride? He snapped. You planned this. You, my own wife, plotted to destroy me, and now you want to talk about pride? Ruth turned to face him, her expression hardening. Do you know what your family did to my mother, Michael? Do you have any idea what it feels like to watch someone you love be worked to death, humiliated, and discarded like they were nothing? Your parents didn't even have the decency to pay for her burial. We had to beg the church to give her a grave. That's what your family left me with? Her words pierced through his anger like a blade. He stopped pacing, his fists unclenching as guilt began to creep in. He had heard stories of how his parents treated their staff, harsh, dismissive, but he had never given it much thought. To him, they were simply part of the backdrop of his privileged childhood, invisible figures who cooked his meals and cleaned his home. He had never imagined that their actions could leave scars deep enough to shape the course of someone's life. That wasn't me, he said softly, almost pleading. I didn't do those things. I was just a boy. But you benefited from it, Ruth shot back, her voice cracking. You lived in that house, ate the food, enjoyed the wealth built on the backs of people like my mother. And when I met you I thought, maybe he's different. Maybe he's not like them. But as the years passed I realized you were just like them, Michael. Proud, blind to the suffering around you, always looking out for yourself. The room fell silent again, the weight of her words settling over them like a heavy blanket. Michael sank back onto the bed, his head in his hands. He wanted to lash out, to deny everything she was saying, but deep down he knew there was truth in her words. He had been blind, to her pain, to his parents' cruelty, to the privilege he had taken for granted all his life. And yet there was another truth that he couldn't ignore. He had loved Ruth with everything he had. Every decision he made, every risk he took had been for her and their future. He looked up at her, his voice barely above a whisper. Did you ever love me, Ruth? Or was I just a means to an end for you? Her eyes softened for the first time that night. She took a hesitant step toward him, then stopped. I didn't plan to love you, she admitted. But somewhere along the way I did. And that's what made this so hard. I wanted to stop Michael. I wanted to forgive, but I couldn't. The pain, the anger, they were too much. Michael closed his eyes, trying to process her words. He felt like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure whether to jump or turn back. The woman he loved was both his greatest comfort and his greatest betrayal. How could he forgive her? And if he didn't, how could he move on knowing the truth of what his family had done? The room seemed to shrink around them, suffocating in its silence. For the first time in his life, Michael didn't know what to do. What would you do right now if you're Michael, or what will be your next move if you're Ruth? Let us know in the comments. Until next time, stay awake,